I can't stress enough how there was so much shame and so much like the concept of homosexuality or being gay was so loaded,
Mm,
and that we, like, even with my own therapist, we didn't use that language. I don't even remember saying to my therapist, hey, I think that guy's hot. Like, that was something that would have been so directly pointing to the reality of this part of myself that was, according to the theory, actually a bit of a mirage and a non-reality, some sort of
mhm,
like temporary state,
mhm.
that to even like admit some form of this to somebody was so scary to me. And
Mm.
so I was not encouraged to, and certainly did not disclose this.
Hello, this is David Frank, and I'm here with TJ Espinoza, and we welcome you to New Kinship, where we are exploring and renewing ideas of belonging, desire, and being a neighbor in the kingdom of Jesus. Join our conversation today with Simon Kent Fung. Simon is a design leader with 15 years in tech and media at Patreon, Google, and Time, after starting his career in independent documentaries.
And most notably for our conversation today, Simon is the creator and host of the podcast Dear Alana, which is a journey through the life of Alana Chen, a devout young woman from Colorado whose journals bring up his own experiences as a gay Catholic. He lives in Denver and San Francisco, and he recently lost his pandemic dog named Sophie, who you can tell he has some affection for. So we appreciate that Simon could join us. I'll just say, I think I was the one in the past year who first listened to the podcast because I had heard about it through some of the faith and sexuality circles. And I was like, oh, we should engage this because we had started engaging some of the ex-gay sort of thinkers and speakers. And I was like, wow, we need this voice in kind of the mix as we think about these things, think about the impact on these conversations. So I'm glad we could connect and have you on today. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thank you for
Thanks for
joining,
having me.
Simon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Could you share, just for our listeners who are unfamiliar with Dear Alana, what is it about and how did it develop?
Sure. So Dear Alana is a limited series podcast that was released last year, actually around this time. And it's a story that, or it's a podcast that's about the life and ultimately the death of a young woman named Alana Chen. Alana was a young Catholic from around Boulder, Colorado. And she, how would I describe her? She was this incredibly vibrant, exuberant person.
Mm.
And she was an athlete. She was a poet and writer. She was into fashion and making her own clothing. And she was this like all-star student. She went to CU Boulder. And she was also someone who had a really, I think, unique young, like, or early adolescence, in that at 14, she, or even earlier than that, she really fell in love with the Catholic Church, and in
Mm.
particular had this really strong desire to be a nun, a Catholic nun,
Mm.
and felt that calling. And so that was sort of something I think that made her stand out among her friends. But she also had the secret, and at 14 she came out to her priest at her parish, and he unfortunately, and this is according to Alana's own journals, he unfortunately told her not to tell her family and to
Mm.
keep that information from them. And
Mm.
so basically, through several other resources and spiritual guides in her life, she ended up pursuing conversion therapy, and ultimately, through other complications in her life, she ended up unfortunately taking her life at the age of 24. And she died in 2019. And I came across her story because I simply read about it in the news. I had no connection to her. I had never met her, but I read about her story in the news when it had happened, and was very much kind of shaken by it because of, at least from the reporting, some of the parallels that I could relate to. And so I did a lot of, as much research as I could, just to try to see who she was and understand who she was, and ended up making contact with her family, in particular her mother. I
Mm.
reached out to her, and I just wanted to offer my condolences, and also share a little bit of my own backstory, which we can talk about, but just to offer sort of a sense of like consolation, or I don't know, just to let her know that I could relate to different parts of her daughter's story, and didn't expect any kind of reply or response, but she did get back to me, and after a few months we ended up talking for the first time, and that led to a kind of almost 2 year kind of just texting and phone call relationship where we would just talk about Alana, and so that was back in, again, 2019 and 2020. And so then the pandemic happened, and I kind of burned out from my career, and I needed to take a bit of a break, and I did. And I remember this was 2021 in August, and I was lying awake in bed and 2 a.m. and I couldn't sleep, and Alana's story just kept on haunting me. Like, I felt like I, knew a lot of the details, but there was so much more that I felt was still unexplored. And so I kind of had this pretty vivid, like, feeling of like wanting to spend some time to explore and understand more what happened to Alana, and to perhaps document that process. And that was the kind of early idea for having that be an audio project. I got on a call with her family and their attorney, and I shared this idea, and wanted to see if they'd be interested in, would be open in me pursuing this kind of a project, and they were very open, and that led to the beginnings of me learning more about Alana, and ultimately, making the podcast.
Mm. Mm.
One of my favorite things about the podcast is that your own story was interspersed throughout the series. So would you be willing to talk a little bit about how your story relates? You touched on it, but I think some of our listeners who haven't heard the podcast would be interested in that as well.
Yeah, totally. So I'm about, I think, 12 years older than Alana. And so at some level, and I grew up in Canada, and I worked in the US after I graduated college for since that point. But I would say in many ways, you couldn't be more different, right? In terms of location and generally generationally as well. But I think the parts that, again, from the early reporting about her life, the parts that I could connect to and felt were familiar were certainly her deep desire to, her deep sense of a calling or a vocation to religious life. That was something that I experienced as a teenager and into throughout my early 20s, and well, actually all of my 20s. I wanted to become a Catholic priest, and that was something that I felt was my calling. So I think that was one point of similarity. Another point of similarity was this involvement in conversion therapy, which I know is a maybe loaded term, and we can certainly get into and define what that is. But I spent, I would say, most of my 20s in various forms of conversion therapy, whether that was one-on-one counseling, one-on-one counseling with a therapist, all the way through to group therapy, to healing ministries, and sort of more spiritual approaches. And so I could relate to that aspect for sure. And then I'd say the more I learned about her life, I discovered that we were, I would say, part of like a very similar subculture within Catholicism, and shared like common Facebook connections, and it just became even more, the world became even smaller, and those parallels and connections became more and more uncanny the more I looked into the story. And so that became, again, I think the more I learned, the more I discovered we were similar. Of course, we were also very different, and she had, like, I would say, so many friends, and was very much a popular kid who was really well loved. I was very much, in my teen years, like more of a loner, and didn't have that kind of social, I guess, I didn't have as many friends as she did, and didn't have that part of my life I felt very insecure about. And so again, we can get into all the similarities and differences, but yeah, that was what originally drew me to her story.
And in listening to the podcast, part of what you're documenting is also how the local community is dealing with Alana's death. Briefly, kind of leading up to the podcast, and then after that, was there any change in how either the Denver community or the Catholic community has responded?
Yeah, so Lana died in 2019, and I read in the news sort of how the church locally was responding to this, especially as the way in which her death was covered. It really focused in on this particular sore spot, right, which is her involvement in conversion therapy, which Alana actually gave an interview to the Denver Post about shortly before she passed. And so that became kind of a, I guess, lightning rod in a way for kind of how her story was told. And the church locally, the archdiocese and also the parish that she belonged to in college, aggressively denied that that was true or that happened. And so that was, I'd say, one notable kind of response. In talking to people that were there at the time or who either knew Alana and were sort of affected by the news in terms of like people that were in her very tight-knit Catholic community, it sounded like there was quite a bit of silence around her death. And I think there was just a notable absence of addressing some of these subjects other than to sort of lament the unfortunate toll that mental health can have on mental health challenges can have on a person. But other than that, there wasn't really any, I think, meaningful engagement in some of these aspects of her life that a person is complicated, right, and complex, and it's never just one dimensional in terms of how we can understand what's really happening to a person. But I would say there was not any sort of meaningful, from my understanding, attempt to really try to address some of the issues that Alana was struggling with. There are some notable exceptions. I know there was a community of nuns that Alana was very close with that really made some efforts to really try to engage with mental health folks in the community to better understand people who were in Alana's position. But other than that, it's been quiet. And I would say there's also been some other responses from one of her spiritual mentors, who was her spiritual director for about 7 years, who has used his online platform to do the opposite, which is to really aggressively attack her mother and her family for implicating the church in Alana's struggles. And so that's a notable also response. So it runs the gamut, but I think like whenever you are dealing with the topic of, and we should warn our viewers that we are talking about suicide, right? Whenever we are talking about that topic, it is so sensitive and so awkward, and often we don't really know what to say or how to help, or we're afraid that what we might say or do could just make things worse, right? So I understand that piece as well. So it's been, I'd say that's been the response.
Before we go further, I think I'd like to take this thread and unpack conversion therapy as a concept or a practice. And that in part is because we've been talking with a few different contemporary practitioners of this sort of practice or these techniques or this theology. And there's a lot of politics around the terms. And these people don't usually, the ones that we talk with, they reject usually conversion therapy as a category that would apply to them, or reparative therapy sometimes. And you mentioned spiritual healing, sort of transformation type ideas. And that's kind of where the ones we talk with are moving towards. So,
right.
Yeah, I'd be curious, when we talk about conversion therapy in this context, how are you understanding it? And I also understand that obviously you mentioned this was part of your life in their 20s. I think you said you had gone through a lot of iterations of this conversion therapy thing. So yeah, how do you understand it? Yeah. And what sort of practices do you associate with this in particular from your experience or from your research around Alana or other things?
Sure. So I am by no means an expert, other than having gone through, as you mentioned, kind of the various iterations of these practices in the 2000s, starting from the mid 2000s, I would say. But conversion therapy at a broad level is any attempt to change or modify a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. It's a term that was coined by a psychologist, actually I spoke with. I think that the term was first coined in the early 90s to describe the kind of clients who were approaching the psychologist's office who had been through earlier iterations, which were much more, I would say, violent. So they were practices that involved shock therapy or aversion techniques, like having a elastic band snapped against your wrists or that sort of thing every time you felt those attractions. And those practices were probably more predominant 100 years ago, but the psychologist was sort of working with a population that had been through those experiences and was really trying to help them recover from that. And so he found that was the blanket term to describe some of these practices. But conversion therapy today looks a lot different, and I would say those practices are much more rare. Those aggressive, violent practices. Instead, conversion therapy today, I think, has its roots in Freud and neo-Freudian approaches to understanding psychology, which is this idea that Freud pioneered that our childhood experiences, in particular with our parents, are formative to our psychology today. And he has all sorts of interesting theories about how particular challenges or breaks in our relationships with a particular parent can result in different kinds of neuroses and that kind of thing. And so that really, I think, was the germ of a lot of neo-Freudian thinkers and writers who, starting from the 50s, started to posit and theorize about how homosexuality could arise from some of these experiences. And that led to many, many books, many different kinds of approaches. And I would say, maybe fast forwarding a little bit, there were a lot of things that were happening like in the late 60s to really destigmatize homosexuality. The APA removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders in, I believe, the 1974-ish. Well, one definition of homosexuality was removed then, and then fully in 1987. And that set off a lot of it, I think, really divided some of the people in the psychological community who were practicing some of these approaches, which I'll talk about next. And that led to some more formal organizations, one of which I was eventually seeing a psychologist who was connected to, which is called NARTH, which is the National Association of Research and Therapy on Homosexuality. And that was that was sort of the more contemporary spin on conversion therapy, which I'll, I guess, talk about next. And so the iteration that I experienced was rooted in these neo-Freudian ideas of parental detachment, and the therapists in the 80s who banded together to form this organization were really committed to this idea that homosexuality arises from some sort of either developmental delay, where there could be some sort of immaturity in a person's sexual development that results in them sort of getting stunted at this place of feeling attractions or predominant attraction to the same sex. Or there's this idea that because of a lack of bonding between a young person, a child, and their same-sex parent, they lack the kind of masculine or feminine affirmation in their life that they need in order to fully sort of realize that part of themselves. And so as a result, when puberty hits, that sort of need for masculine or feminine identification and affirmation in themselves ends up becoming sexualized, and that becomes something that they experience as homosexuality. And so one of the thinkers in the 70s who really honed in on that particular part of the theory developed what was called this reparative understanding, which is this therapist posited that because of this deficit in masculine or feminine identification or connection in themselves, they had this sort of subconscious drive to try to repair that part of themselves. And so that's what they're seeking for in a same-sex partner. And so she actually really kind of, I guess, positively affirmed this as something that was like a positive or natural process, almost like a body trying to heal itself. And so she actually didn't want, she really scolded a lot of Christian therapists for kind of condemning this aspect of the reparative drive that she described. And so she posited that the way to repair that, to assist in that reparative drive, was to substitute this sort of same-sex partner with a same-sex therapist who could really help that person relate to those parts of their identities, their masculine or feminine parts. And so I'm kind of glossing over all the sort of little nuances and details about these therapies, but ultimately that reparative therapy became, I think, the predominant model that I was very much wrapped up in. And there are other, I would say, as a side note, other kinds of models. There are theories that really have expanded the parental detachment theory and the reparative theory to like peers. So like the lack of bonding between myself, let's say as a young boy, and male peers, or the opposite for females. Like that was the cause of the trauma that resulted in this kind of stunted development. And then there are theories that really look at homosexuality through the lens of addiction, which I think was also very popular at one point, where it is pathological in that sense. And so that's kind of like an overview, I think, of some of the theory behind it. We can talk certainly about what that looked like in terms of the therapy itself and the kinds of techniques and practices that were employed to try to help a person overcome the sort of trauma in their life. But I'd say maybe we can pause there. But that is kind of the sort of theoretical underpinnings of conversion or reparative therapy.
Yeah, thank you. That's very
summary.
helpfully described. Yeah. And it aligns with things that I've heard from some of the guests we've interviewed, that especially that moving beyond just parental problems to this more general, like, gender disconnect, which is tied to a disconnect from peers of the same gender, and trying to like heal those things. And I find that there's often not the nuance of, in general, I think all of us are drawn to often deal with like loneliness through sex. That's like an easy temptation. And so then people who are lonely with same-sex sexual attractions, it's kind of this like self-fulfilling narrative of like, oh, well, see, you're disconnected from your gender. And it's like, well, if you reconnect with friends, then it will indeed, which includes friends of the same sex, it will indeed help probably alleviate some of those ways that you're, coping with your loneliness potentially in some unhealthy ways. And but I'm like, but it doesn't validate your theory.
Right. I think one of the things that made this so compelling for me was that, like you said, there is, well, at least for me, I felt like it explained a lot of my life, right? Like I had been bullied as a child, and that was something that really made me really, really hate school. And I didn't connect with the boys in my class, and I didn't have a good relationship with my dad. My dad was very strict, and I didn't feel emotionally connected with him. And so these theories really, I think, reference a lot of experiences that I had, and it really built a narrative around how those experiences were connected to my eventual, like, sort of stunted development. I think as a side note, what's interesting about these theories, not only do they see homosexuality as pathological, but they also see, like, I think, implicitly have the sort of, are operating from the premise that no one actually is homosexual. Everyone's just sort of a stunted or like developmentally delayed heterosexual person. So, so I think that was comforting to me to learn, right? Or to read about, to be like, oh my God, like I am just developmentally delayed and stunted. Like I can overcome this. And that there's this incredibly compelling narrative that explains and connects a lot of my experiences to this part of me that I really, really don't want to be dealing with. And so there is a big reason why a lot of young people pursue these kinds of therapies and these kinds of ministries. That's, I think, one of the things that made also Alana and my own story somewhat unique, in that typically, and when we hear about in the popular culture conversion therapy, we see examples of young people or people that are coerced into attending camps and have the Bible thrown at them, as that sort of thing. And in both Alana and my own case, this was something that we pursued on our own. In Alana's case, in secret, without her parents or her family knowing. And so I think one of the reasons why is because, as I mentioned, the theories can seem very compelling. Yeah.
But I think in both cases, as from what I hear in the podcast, in both cases, both of you were kind of guided by your spiritual director, or for you, it might have been your formation, like priestly formation director person, to try to consider this as part of Christian life or part of your discipleship journey or part of your vocational formation. Is that right?
That's right. So in Alana's case, her spiritual guides and mentors really kind of promoted a lot of these ideas and introduced her to the therapists and the therapies. In my case, it was my spiritual director also who heavily encouraged me when I came out to him to find a therapist that was associated with Narth. And I think this was maybe at some point, at some level, a snapshot in time, although I know it happened, it's still very, very common. But I think in a lot of these cases, this kind of guidance pastorally was the norm among a very specific, I think, subset of clergy, which would probably self-identify as more conservative or orthodox. But I think it was very much in the water, in the books, in the kinds of talks, in the kind of influencers that were really informing that particular subculture, was this idea that, like these reparative models are kind of taken for granted as to why people are gay. And so there's a way to address it and there's a way to work through it. I would say, like, the other piece of this, which, David, you kind of brought up, is that on the one hand, these theories really draw from like real life experiences, right? That a lot of people have. On the other hand, it was probably only by in starting to revisit a lot of this material, I kept also really detailed notes of my own therapeutic experiences, but it was only in reflecting on it that I also realized that, hey, like, a lot of people who aren't gay or same-sex attracted also have these experiences.
Yeah.
Right. And it's actually really common for young people to feel isolated and for people to feel disconnected from one or both of their parents. And I think that really started to like open up another way of looking at this, which is that this may not be the only explanation for why a person is the way they are. And especially if there are counterexamples, and we might just be really selectively looking at and building a narrative around things that is actually really common.
One thing this has made me think about is how careful you have to be with theory formation, like conceptualizing theories based on phenomena as you try to like make this narrative around explanations of reality. Like, because as you said, there's this selection issue that didn't seem to be recognized by these theorists, that even people that we call straight can have this disconnect from their parents and they still end up being straight. Like, this is not like something wasn't going right in how these theories were being formed based on the sampling that they were doing, or based on like conceptualizing. And I don't know enough about the theories or the history to pull out which threads were so questionable, but there's some issue here. And it becomes worse when the theory starts being applied to real people and actually causing like harm to people. So, yeah.
And could you, one of the, what you guys are saying, that it's like, oh, working on your parental relationships and like these things are good for all people. And there's like, I kind of expect that anyone who goes through some of this therapy, gay or straight, would receive good benefits from being listened to and encouraged and having intentional conversations with family members. And so, for some of our guests that we've interviewed, if you're listening, it's like, I assume that there's good work being done. But, I've been wondering, well, what is, for these things that are just like, oh yeah, those are generally good things to like look into for people, what is causing people to have such harm happen to them? Like, where's the part where this stuff kind of goes radically wrong? And one of my hypotheses is how much of it has to do with expectation of like what outcomes you should expect to come from it. What's your experience, Simon?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think first of all, for me, finding a reparative therapist or a conversion therapist was the first time I found any therapist. And so having like actually someone listen to me and having us reflect on different parts of my life or my childhood or whatever was actually very, very helpful, right? From just a purely like therapeutic, like from a purely like having the first opportunity to talk to someone about my life in this way. And so I would say that's also probably a common experience for a lot of young people that grow up in more maybe conservative spaces, right? Where a lot of therapists that are proposed to them by the church are really their first exposure to this forum, right? And that, I think, is what makes it messy and complicated for people to start to distinguish between what's being helpful and what's being harmful about this. In Alana's case, in my case, we both sought out therapists that were sort of quote unquote trustworthy and committed Catholics and people that were theologically and ideologically aligned with our what we wanted in a therapist as well. And so we felt a certain amount of trust and abandon to these people. I think it's really taken me about a decade to reflect on my experience, because before getting into some of the ways in which I think it really does harm people, I do want to talk about what it looked like, right?
Yeah,
what was the actual kinds of therapeutic techniques that were employed on me. And so in my case, it was, again, drawing from this reparative model of a detachment that I felt from my masculine identity that was a result of a psychological trauma either from my parents or peers. A lot of it was first of all getting acquainted with this theory, doing a lot of reflections on ways in which I was feeling disconnected from my peers or my father. And a lot of it was trying to identify the particular, I guess, like need that was not being met because of those experiences. So for example, with a peer, like, and this actually, maybe this is best described in some of my group therapy experiences, because this helps the person to visualize that I was in group therapy following my one-on-one therapy with other young men that were same-sex attracted. And so what we had to do was I'd have one of the people in the group stand in for someone that we could remember that week we felt was attractive, right? Maybe I saw someone on the subway or on the bus or something and I had to sort of like project onto this person in the group and remember who this from memory, like the attributes about this person I found attractive, right? And so a lot of it had to be about identifying the physical attributes that I was drawn to. Let's just say I really liked this person's, like, I don't know, muscly arms or something like that, right? It was about then scraping one's memory for aspects of my childhood in which I might have felt a detachment from a person because of that attribute. So maybe I was beat up or punched or shoved, and there was some aspect of that person's arm that was traumatizing to me. And so it was about connecting things that I was drawn to trauma from my past and trying to make those associations so that I could then come to a point where I could see how that unmet need for, let's say in that case, an embrace or a friendly interaction with that person was actually something that I was now seeking out subconsciously. And it was sort of like expressing itself in this attraction, if that makes sense. And so a lot of the work was about really tying one's experience of attraction and in particular to particular attributes or physical attributes or behavioral attributes to examples of trauma from one's past, so that one could start to deconstruct that attraction, so to speak. And that would then the next step after that would be to, let's say, I'm kind of maybe conflating a few different kinds of techniques, but
Sure.
But the next step after that would be to try to identify the narrative around that and to then see how that narrative was something that I could rewrite. So for example, if there was somebody that, let's say in that case, the act of being bullied was something that led to a particular narrative in my mind about myself, let's say, oh, I'm not cool enough to be with these boys or whatever. The idea was then to start to rewrite that narrative by thinking about ways in which I am cool, in which I do have those attributes that I felt I was missing, or that need that wasn't met was actually something that I can meet in different ways now as an adult. So it was sort of like coaching a person to not only deconstruct the attraction, but then find ways to meet that hidden or unmet need today, so that that healing, quote unquote, could happen. And then I would sort of like recover from that particular piece of deficit to my masculinity, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Wow. May I ask, did they allow you and your colleagues or your associates in the group therapy to like become friends, or was that not something they talked? They said no friendships, just be in this space together. Or
I would say they weren't. There wasn't a hard line about being friends. There were hard lines about sexual activity, obviously.
Yeah.
And I do remember there was at one point we were also committed. There was, I think, one of my co-participants was basically like saying like, we're not here to be friends. Like we're here to work. We're here to do the work. And so I think we were all like very much like, yes. Yeah.
And when you were in that experience, did you narrate change? Like, did you reflect on your life and you were telling your counselors or directors or whatever, like I am feeling change, and this is getting me closer to that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I was making progress, and I talk a bit about this in the podcast. Like, for example, my therapist had me take up a sport, right? And that was something that was important because it would help me heal my quote unquote wounds around feeling inadequate in those areas.
Yeah.
So I took up a martial art, and I would practice some of these techniques, not only in the moment, but then there were social techniques that I was, asked to practice around how to better relate to other men. Right. And yeah. And so I remember just like feeling like, oh my God, like this person in the change room talked to me. And like, that means that they affirm my masculine identity, and that I'm now feeling like I'm making progress in that way. And so I would report some of these like wins to my therapist, and he was like very encouraging. He was like, he's like, based on the trajectory you're on, like between 1 and 5 years, you will be changed. You will experience, that orientation change that you're seeking. And so I was very hopeful and optimistic. I felt like I was making progress, and I was looking to these guides to kind of like tell me how I was doing. Right. And they were very encouraging.
And did orientation change, was it the emphasis on an absence of homosexual attraction, or was it on gaining the presence of heterosexual attraction?
I think it was more the latter. I don't know if it was, I don't know. I don't remember if there was any kind of breakdown of exactly how much the homosexual attractions would diminish. Certainly that was part of it. It would be a diminishment of that and an increasing of the opposite sex attraction. Again, part of it is because the theory is that this is a developmental delay. And so like, if you can unblock it, you'll like naturally like
open
up and move towards heterosexuality. And I think that the like, so that was kind of I guess the promise and the projection of how things would develop as I like stuck with the program.
Did you try to, if I may ask, date women in the process of this to solidify your growth?
I did. And I feel so bad for, I'm sorry to the women I went on dates with, but yes, I did try. And that was something that was encouraged in my therapy. Part of the theory is also that, it's so interesting. There's so many sides to the theory now that I'm reflecting on it. Not only can homosexuality, according to the theory, be caused by sort of detachment from the same-sex parent, it can also be caused by negative experiences with the opposite sex parent, right? So the idea is that, in my case, if I had an overbearing mother or a negative experience of femininity in my life, that would sort of like scare me away from women, I guess at some basic level, or cause some sort of aversion to create some sort of aversion towards females and the feminine. And so some of the work also involved working on those parts of my past, so to speak, right, that were connected to opposite sex experiences, and in a way deconstructing some of those. And so, like there was a track that at some point I reached around working on those topics, and then having that play out in real life in terms of starting to date or express interest and try to connect with the opposite sex.
Were you encouraged to have some level of transparency with the fact that you weren't totally straight?
Or whatever, yeah.
No, not at all. I mean, I think I can't stress enough how I think this has really changed a little bit now, possibly in a lot of spaces, but maybe not, and still still maybe a lot of people can still relate to this. But I think there was so much shame and so much like the concept of homosexuality or being gay was so loaded, and that we, like, even with my own therapist, we didn't use that language. We talked about same-sex attraction. We used other ways to describe. I don't even remember saying to my therapist, "Hey, I think that guy's hot." Like, that was something that would have been so directly pointing to the reality of this part of myself that was, according to the theory, actually a bit of a mirage and a non-reality, some sort of like temporary state, that to even like admit some form of this to somebody was so scary to me. And so I was not encouraged to, and certainly did not disclose this to the woman that I was going on dates with.
I'm wondering, Simon, how long did people last in this, under this sort of therapeutic regime? Like, did people, a lot of people that you know, and maybe yourself, like, were you guys in it for 5 years, like 9 years, 10 years, like 1 year? How long did people last under this thing?
Yeah, I've met people that have been in these kinds of therapies for over a decade. And I think part of it is because there's always something more to do, right? There's always something more to heal from. And it's just sort of like, well, if I just do this, then I will get there. And I'd say the other piece of this that's important to bring up is, in parallel to the psychological language and theory and the therapeutic environment from a psychological perspective, there was also this other side to these approaches, which is the spiritual. Right. So there were ministries that really sprung up to really try to serve same-sex attracted people in churches. And there were also spiritual theories that developed in parallel to these psychological ones. And in many cases, they dovetailed with or were sort of the other sides of the coin, the psychological coin, right? There were the spiritual sides of the coin to these theories. And so they would explain homosexuality as spiritual brokenness, right? So not just like on the flip side of the psychological trauma one might have experienced, there's a sense of, there's the spiritual language of now spiritual brokenness. So you're not gay because that's who you are. It's because you're spiritually broken. There's the language of the fall. There were theories about demonic influence. And this is more, maybe it's philosophical, but certainly in the Catholic tradition, there's this idea of an affective disorder, right? Or so that was, I think, another piece of how and I think Alana's like place in the church exposed us to not only the psychological explanations, but also the spiritual ones, which are really, I think, even more fuzzy to process and to discern, right? Because they're now, it's like, wow, like the reason why I'm experiencing these attractions is because of like a relationship with God thing, a spiritual thing. And so like, think about in our own lives, like the ways in which it can be really hard to track progress in those areas. It can be really hard to like know, like, am I moving in the right direction here? And so I think that's another reason why people stick around, is because now there's this other additional spiritual piece that I need to work on.
Can we also talk about your off-ramp from this sort of therapeutic like system? Like, when did the system or the narrative like not make sense? That this was the way that maybe the outcomes were not possible, or this didn't make sense with how you were trying to live life?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I was in various forms of this therapy throughout my 20s. Even after I left the group therapy experience, I spent many years sort of like working on it on my own, right? Applying, exercising, practicing these different ways to deconstruct my attractions. And I would say it was really when I I was living in New York City, and that's where I was attending a lot of this therapy, and moved to the West Coast for work. And I was very lonely. I think a lot of this is very isolating, these, this kind of, these kinds of therapies, because first of all, I didn't really tell anyone I was doing it. It was such a shameful part of me that I wanted to get rid of so that I could move on and apply to seminary. But like, I would say it was, when I moved to the West Coast, and I was like alone in my apartment and coming home at night, and I was so depressed. I was so depressed, and I didn't know why. I just felt like I was stuck. I felt like I wasn't making the progress in these areas that I was hoping for. And really, it was just it was probably two things in parallel. One, it was just feeling so tired and exhausted from this. Like, think about the psychological toll of constantly having to like self-monitor and police one's thoughts around attraction, right? And then in parallel to that, just feeling this question, or sensing this in very small, quiet voice of just being like, is this the life? Do you want to live your life this way? Is this what life is about? And so there was just the small opening of like, what if I don't have to continue doing this? And it felt scandalous, right? It felt like I was like conceding in some way to or I was failing in some way, right? It felt like a huge, because it felt like this was the only way for me. And so to consider that maybe I would not do this, not try to change, and perhaps see where that took me, was so scandalous and so scary. So I would say that was the beginning, but it was probably it wasn't until probably at least another decade, right, that I began to start to think about the ways in which this was negatively impacting my life. And I spoke with an older conversion therapy, I guess he would call himself a survivor, or someone who went through more aggressive kinds of forms of this. And he says that he's spoken with hundreds and hundreds of people that have been through these programs and approaches. And he says it takes on average about 10 years for someone to really start to feel even comfortable admitting that they had attended these programs or sought these therapists. And I think this goes to your earlier question, which I don't think I answered, which is the question of harm, right? And I would say the harm was, and I'm still unpacking it, but I think at its core, the harm for me and my own reflections has to do with the ways in which conversion therapy is premised on and actually requires as a sort of life source shame in order to actually be legit, in order to legitimize itself. And so let me try to unpack that. What I mean is that I think as people that are same-sex attracted, especially in the church, there's several layers of shame that we struggle with, right? There's, first of all, the shame that we feel for being different, right? It's just like our experience is somewhat different from our heterosexual peers. We don't feel like we get to participate in a lot of the similar rites of passage. We feel just different and outside, like outsiders. And so there's shame around that experience. Two, these theories now introduce this idea that you're gay or you are the way you are because of a trauma, because something horrible happened to you when you were younger. And so there's now sort of, oh my God, I need to, unpack that. Or there's shame around maybe discovering that or making that connection. And in terms of how something that happened to me in the past could have resulted in this horrible, horrible burden. And then thirdly, I think the shame, there's like an additional layer of shame for those who do seek out conversion therapy or who go through it. I think there's the shame of now feeling like a complete failure when you don't experience the kind of change that you seek. And now I think I remember feeling like I must be so broken that I can't meet this 1 to 5 year timeline. I must be so damaged that like I can't even, there's something so wrong with me that I'm not seeing the results that I was seeking or that I was promised. And so like that triple like stacking of shame, I think, is really, really devastating for someone to carry. And that, like, I think at no point in the kinds of therapeutic approaches that I saw was that shame addressed. I think it was addressed sort of on the surface with words saying like, hey, like, this is a part of you that is not defining, and so we shouldn't feel like it's this horrible thing. And there were sort of, I think, attempts to talk about shame, but on reflection, what I'm starting to realize is that none of us would be seeking out these therapies if we didn't at some level feel ashamed about ourselves. And so it's this weird chicken and egg, or I don't know what the analogy is, but it's this weird dynamic where the very thing you're seeking out depends on you cultivating and maintaining some deep level of shame in order for that service to exist in the first place, if that makes sense. And so there's a bit of a conflict of interest there is sort of where I've landed. And that's sort of why it's, no matter how much these programs might be talking about healing or liberation at some level, they're kind of dependent on a person cultivating or still maintaining some deep level of shame. And I know it's a bold statement. It's still something I may be, processing or reflecting. It's a theory I'm trying on, but I think that is if I had to pinpoint the ways in which this stuff is damaging, it's the ways in which these theories really allow shame to fester. At the core, the conversion therapy theories and narratives really are premised on this idea that your attractions are pathological, right?
Yeah.
Or even maybe on the spiritual side, a sort of brokenness that is unhealed. And so I think the same to the extent that a person now has to live with this sense of self and how that can affect a person, I think that path is probably the path that results in the more common rates of suicidality around people who have experienced this. And I don't have the psychological background to track exactly how that will unfold, but I would say that's probably the pathway, if I had to point to something.
Yeah, thank you. Especially hearing you articulate the kind of mental exercises that were encouraged and part of the practices. Like, wow, how heavy to go from seeing someone who's pretty on the street and then be like, now I have to connect that with like my traumas. And like, like I was just walking down the street. And it makes me really grateful for the side B space that I've in some ways wandered into, where it's like, they're just pretty. Like, you can just acknowledge the beauty of them. And we would emphasize that, like, beauty can lead to lust, but it doesn't have to. And to separate out those things and to be able to just sit in the goodness and in any necessary ways repent or detach from temptation to sin. And so I'm just grieved by hearing like the burden placed on your shoulders for those years in which is such like a just internal thing that had been kind of encouraged or programmed into your thinking. I would imagine that would take years to process through.
Yeah, I would say it's hard. In Alana's case, I think one thing to share about Alana's story is that she left behind like over 20 journals, and her family was very gracious to share that, allow me to read them. And it was a huge responsibility and certainly like so sensitive. But Alana does write about how, she was told that her attractions were a result of her relationship with her mother, and encouraged to really examine that. And so there is this kind of like, I guess, wild goose chase that we're set on to try to connect our attractions to trauma and or even to like, I guess, like narrate or create a new narrative around what is trauma in our lives, so that we can have something to work on. And I think there's that's just, at some level, that's very exhausting. And the mind is, I don't know, I've just have such a, the mind is so resilient in many ways, but it's also very fragile. It's open to suggestion. It's open to subtle ways of manipulation and ways in which we shift how we see ourselves, how we see other people. And I think these theories really play in that space. And so it's really, really, we just have to be really careful. And especially when we're dealing with a developing mind or a younger population, it's just so delicate. And I think we need to tread really lightly.
Mm-hmm. In a lot of our conversations with others, usually, again, these practitioners of these sort of ideas or therapies, sexual orientation as a concept is often fraught for them. Many of them, you spoke about it very well at different points, so I hear the echoes of what you mentioned and what they have said to us. And it's ideas like sexual orientation is not a thing, or else, again, this is just this, you have this temporary blockage, or you have this temporary like impairment, and we're moving forward towards your true heterosexual fulfillment as like a man or a woman or something like that. Like they say these things. How from your beginning of this journey, engaging some of these techniques or practices, how did you understand sexual orientation at that point versus how do you understand it now after coming through your life history, examining, engaging with Alana's story, all of these things?
I would say when I first started to realize I was different, or start to notice I was drawn to or attracted to the same sex, and as I was becoming a teenager and all of that. So I would say I didn't have the language to think of orientation. I didn't relate to the ways in which gay people were portrayed on the news or on the television. I didn't know anyone who was gay. It was something that I just had no like feeling of affinity towards, right? So I think the language of orientation from the perspective of like that whole world of the gay community was not something that I connected with. And so when I was really like starting to feel like, oh my God, this is not going away, and started to research on the internet and try to find resources, and stumbled across a lot of these ex-gay ministries and reparative therapy forums and groups, that's when I was like, oh my God, like I think adopted the perspective of that world around the homosexual orientation being something that was temporary, and that was something that could be resolved. And like I said earlier, that no one actually is homosexual. They're just sort of stunted heterosexuals. So that kind of like thing, I think really was at a formative time in my development, baked in to how I saw myself in orientation. And I would say a lot of those elements still persist. I'm still a work in progress, in the sense that I think I feel how compelling a lot of these explanations are, and will find myself slipping into this conception often. It wasn't until I, almost 10 years after coming out of these experiences, started to really like connect with other gay Catholics, some of whom had not ever gone through these kinds of therapies or tried to change their orientation, that I guess for the first time was exposed to people that just had a different self-conception or even relationship to the church. And that's really when I began to like be exposed to the possibility that I could see this part of myself, see the way in which I'm drawn to connection and relationship, see that as something that could be a gift, see that as something that could be a part of how God created me. And it's been a struggle, right? I mean, ultimately we're talking about, I think I feel like I'm knowing, especially your audience, I feel I don't want to be presumptuous or paint this with blanket statements, in the sense that I don't want to claim the word self-acceptance purely from the perspective of the only path to self-acceptance is to embrace one's gay identity. I don't, I know it's more complicated than that, and I don't want to monopolize the word acceptance. But I would say for me, a lot of, if you had to sum it up, it had to do with this journey towards self-acceptance. That being said, I know for a lot of people, self-acceptance looks like something else, right? It doesn't necessarily look like affirming this part of themselves. It might mean accepting the existence of this struggle or this tension. And I get that. But I think we have that in common, right? In the sense, I think we are looking for self-acceptance. I think that can look like different things. But I think it was for me, like, meeting other people that had different perspectives on what integration looked like. And then I think in making the podcast, it was in reading Alana's own words and seeing the huge disconnect between the way in which she saw herself and how poorly, in many ways, she thought of herself, how inadequate she saw herself, how spiritually and psychologically broken she saw herself. Seeing the discrepancy between that self-conception and how I felt like she really was, from the ways in which talking to her friends and family, the people that knew her, saw her, it was like, wow, like that really started to like plant the seed in me as to think about the ways in which I also have that discrepancy, right? Where that gulf is so large where maybe I'm actually not this complete and utter failure, right? Like to start to plant the seed around like what it could look like to have compassion towards myself. It really took seeing that someone else do that to themselves, you know, to start to like see that I was also doing that. I was also doing that to myself, and that wasn't, my self-conception wasn't necessarily an accurate representation of reality. So yeah, I guess it's a long-winded way of saying that's how some of my conception of sexual orientation has shifted.
Yeah. Can I also ask, so a lot of our listeners are Christians, and I think you'd be curious, how did this experience, and of course you don't have to say much, but how does this experience impact your relationship to the church? Because I think for many people, they have a complex relationship with the church after this, especially if they were like from traditional conservative communities, especially if a lot of spirituality was tied to this sort of these therapies. How did that impact you? Did you move away from the church for a time and then come back? Did you kind of on the peripheries? Did you just stay at the church the whole time? Maybe go to a different church with different theology? Like, how did this impact you, if you're willing to say?
Yeah, totally. I would say I'm still a Catholic. I'm still practicing. I still go to mass. I think what's different is that, I mean, this is a bit of a backstory, but when I moved to the Bay Area, that's when I was starting to like have some distance from that world. And it was really, as I mentioned, meeting other gay Catholics that didn't have a lot of this similar baggage. I mean, they had baggage, but not in the same exact same way. Yeah. And also meeting older senior Catholics who were self-identified as gay or queer, this was in the context of a parish that I met in San Francisco that really had a fascinating history, in that it was located in the sort of neighborhood in the Castro, and was this sort of dying, older, graying parish until like the neighborhood started to really fill up with young gay men. And then during the AIDS epidemic, that's when the parish, which had formerly been really separate from this community, opened up its doors to just host funerals, and to a lot of the parishioners would take in these young men and nurse them in hospice. And that became a way, just because they saw the need, and a lot of these young men were dying and their families did not want to have anything to do with them. And so that actually just forged a really new relationship between the local parish and the neighborhood. And it's continued to this day. And so this parish is predominantly tended by gay folks, and a lot of them are seniors now. And meeting some of these people who had rich and interesting lives, and who were gay. Some of them were in relationships, some of them were not. But I think that like seeing a future, seeing examples of a future for a person who still like loves the church and loves God and is like, it's such a different experience to go to a parish where people are there by choice. It's such a beautiful experience. Seeing that was really, really helpful in the sense that I certainly came with a lot of judgment. I felt like I'm not like them. Like I'm not sinners like these people in this way. But I started to get to know some of these folks, and that really, I guess, opened up another pathway, right? As far as like what it could look like to move towards a place of acceptance of this part of one's identity. And again, I know that's a controversial statement. A lot of people would disagree with that being even something to aspire towards, right? But seeing examples of that in real life and people who were older was kind of a game changer for me, and really continues today in terms of my own spirituality and practice and comfort level with like sharing this part of my story. Like I was prepared to take all of this to the grave, right? My plan was I'm gonna change my orientation. I'm gonna become a priest, right? Because I was so by the book that I had taken the 2005 Vatican document so seriously that basically prohibited anyone who had these quote unquote deep-seated homosexual attractions from entering seminary. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to clear this up so that I can become a Catholic priest, and then I'm going to change the world, and no one needs to know, right? So that was my plan. And so to now be in a position where I can feel like comfortable enough to just share this part of my life and not have to like pretend or perform anything about my life is a huge shift. And at some level, I would say is the kind of grace. I see a lot of grace in that journey.
Can you share more if there are just any strategies of spiritual practices that have promoted a healthier life, thinking, spirituality for yourself that may be helpful for especially other gay Christians, but others in...
Yeah, I'd say a big game changer, as I mentioned, is finding community, and that's something that is pretty universal, right? No matter who you are. But like I said, I think there were a lot of blockages for me to be able to find community. Ironically, it was probably the group therapy that was my first taste of that, because it was the first time that I could be open about this very secretive and hidden part of my life that I was so ashamed of with other people. And I think like being able to show up in spaces and with people unvarnished, without having to perform, without having to guard one's speech and just to be able to like let one's hair down, I think is so important, and something that we all seek, right? And it may not be available to us all the time, but I'd say like the challenge for a lot of queer people in the church, I think the challenge is that we have been given tools and ideas that really, really are designed to isolate us. Maybe they're not intentionally or self-consciously aware that that's what they're for, but they were encouraged to keep things secret. Alana was told not to tell her family. Like there's so many ways in which we are, I think the shame and the embarrassment around this aspect of our identity causes us to self-isolate, right? And sometimes that self-isolation is presented as virtue. It's presented as this sort of like martyrdom that one's supposed to now, embrace, and it's a good thing, right? And so that, but the net effect of all that is isolation, and that I think is so dangerous and is so anti-Christian. It's so anti-incarnational, right? Because we're not meant to be these isolated islands. We are built for community and communion, right? And so I would say that like that's a big risk factor for this population as to why that kind of community can be out of reach. But like, I guess I would say there are more and more people that are maybe 10 years after these experiences now speaking out and sharing. And I'm so grateful for the communities and friends that I've found who I can be honest and open with about this part of my life. A lot of us have gone through similar experiences. And so finding community, however you can, that allows you to be vulnerable and real is probably the like biggest thing that's helped me, both from a like mental health perspective, but then also spiritually, right? Because it's through these relationships that I'm able to taste God. And I think part of, if I look back, what I guess like God was doing in my life was he was sort of untying some of the things that were preventing me from experiencing connection and communion. Because how can you really experience that if you are always hiding a part of yourself, feeling like you have to, be someone else in the future so that so that you can live your life and live out your vocation and calling? Like there's a lot of obstacles to tasting that goodness. And so I'd say that that's probably a big part of the practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
For this, I think, final question, I just love to hear, as a good sexual ethic is one that promotes shalom, flourishing, peace in our lives, well-being. What principles are you maybe kind of working with, or how are you putting together in these days what a good sexual ethic is?
Oh goodness, this is a big question.
Or you can identify just a few key principles or something.
I've spent so much of my life as a perfectionist, as a person that's, similar to Alana, as the good kid, right? The kid that really wanted to do everything by the book and perfectly. And I've spent so much of my life, because of that sort of temperament, like operating from this very principled place, right? Where I kind of like assess the situation, identify like the sort of principled way of understanding things, of understanding the ethics behind things, of plotting out the right way to behave or act in a particular situation. And I don't think that will ever go away. I think a lot of the topics you address on your podcast around principles of for a sexual ethic and are, I think, really comfortable for me, right? It's a comfortable space for me to experience my life through. I know we've been using this word. I'm just noticing we've been using that word experience a lot, but I don't know if there's another word for it. But what I feel like where I'm at now is, having like known and studied and applied a lot of the like principles, I realize that there is no substitute for living it. There's no substitute for learning by doing. There's no substitute for the like insights that one can glean from actually navigating these questions in relationship, right? From actually, whether that's with another person in a sexual relationship or not. I think there's I don't know. I think I'm just at a point where anything I say, I feel like, is so inadequate. It's like, okay, cool. Yeah, there's some guidelines around, I don't know. We can go into natural law. We can talk about all the ways in which, the sort of like cascade of philosophy can impact a sexual ethic. But ultimately, I don't know. I just think there's a world to be discovered in actually asking those questions in relationship, if that makes sense. Doing it in real life with another person is so, it's so rich, and is I think that's sort of where I'm at now, because I've lived in my head for so long, and that I don't think I'll ever stop living in my head. but instead, what I'm learning is a very different dimension of reality that only comes from experience, right? From that sort of doing and making those mistakes and seeing how your actions impact other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can really resonate with the perfectionist stuck in your head, and times where the Lord has encouraged me and challenged me, there's that verse. It's like, it talks about like through the constant practice of discernment, figure out what is like good and evil. And that word like practice is like, oh, like discernment isn't something I just like figure out abstractly and then like live out perfectly. It's this constant thing that does have to get worked out in real life, in relationship, and through that continual inviting, I think, God to say, help me discern what is good and evil, and know that it will be trial and error in some regard. And sometimes there's errors we make that we're like, I should have seen that one coming. And
oh, sorry.
I was just say, and the Lord is gracious in that he continually calls us back through grace and repentance and in joy and figuring stuff out and partnering with him in the journey.
Absolutely. Like, welcome to the human condition, right? Like, why are there so many, why do we resonate with like music and songwriting so much, right? It's because people are just like making a whole bunch of mistakes and like, oh my God, I didn't know I could be hurt in this way or hurt other people in this way. And it's like, oh wow, like if everything could be solved with like a few core principles that we adhere to and convince everyone else to adhere to, there would be no more music. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think like, first of all, that just seems impossible, but I don't know, right now I'm planning a trip to Japan in October, and historically I was a very like much a planner, right? Very much like planning out my itinerary. Here's what we're going to do day 1, day 2, day 3, like here are the restaurants, here's the spreadsheet. And I think in recent years, I've just been more like, this is all kind of foolhardy and a little bit restrictive and limiting, because like, I don't know what I'm going to find in Tokyo. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, there's so much that can be discovered only once I'm there. And I think that's kind of where I'm at in general with life, which is yes, principles, yes, planning, yes, spreadsheets. And that can only go so far. Yeah.
There's wisdom in that. So much wisdom, I think.
Well, thank you, Simon. I really appreciate it. And I know, I'm grateful for your contribution to the questions we're asking. And this is, very helpful.
Simon, we'll put a link to the podcast in the show notes. Is there any other place that people could connect with you online if they're interested?
Sure. I mean, I'd say the website, dearalana.com, is probably a good starting point, because you can link off to my own personal socials from there or to my website. And that's probably the simplest place to learn more about Alana's story and by extension, my own story.
This is a question. Are there any upcoming projects that you're able to share about related to this topic or other topics? No problem if not. I'm just curious personally. So.
They're still incubating. I'm working on a few projects that are probably adjacent to some of these topics, but they're still early. Like I think it's taken me the last year to just unfurl a little bit after I spent 2 years making the podcast, and so just processing that and hearing from a lot of listeners, and so that's been my year. And so moving forward, I'm hopeful to continue in telling stories, and just stay tuned.
Yeah, we will. I'm looking forward to the next project coming out. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, listeners. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Hey, thank you for joining for another episode of New Kinship. We would always appreciate any feedback. Feel free to reach out to us. You can find us on Instagram. We publish our episodes as well as some writings on Substack. But we're also on all your favorite podcast apps. If you've already liked and subscribed but want to support the podcast more, we have a small Patreon crew who is really valuable to us, both in their feedback and their generous monthly support in amounts ranging just from $1 to $25, which helps make this work possible. This is a labor of love, and we would love to have you join the patron crew.